Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening.
Good afternoon, good morning.
So people joining in from various parts of the world. This is the only forum where I can wish good morning, good night, good evening, everything. And I have the speaker who is actually at a time zone which is a midnight. So thanks to her. We are on a 79th International Weekly Session meeting on COVID edition in association with CMAAO. We have started this last year. During the pandemic, we brought telemedicine subject last week, the importance of bringing all the think tank experts on the same forum. A concept started, to fight this pandemic by Dr. K.K. Agarwal, who is not with us right now. We have been discussing today, 9th of October, 2021. We have been in a very state of confusion of vaccination, what's going on. We see a lot of questions coming up, booster dose, what's about kids, everything. So today we want to present again an expert from US, bringing the topic. This is our shot to change the world, an update on booster, kids and equity. So this is an update which will be given by Dr. Monica Vasudev. She's an allergist and a clinical immunologist from city of Wisconsin, USA. Just a brief introduction I would like to give. We all know her. She's not a new face, and she's graduated the bachelor's degree in science and biochemistry from McMaster University of Canada. She pursued her medical degree from MS Ramaiah College in Bangalore, India. She contributed as a group assistant editor and a writer in IJCP publication group. She completed a residency in internal medicine, followed by a fellowship in allergy and clinical and immunology from Medical College of Wisconsin, where she continued to be the faculty for 5 years. She was also the assistant professor and a program director of Infuse Center. She has served in various committees in American Academy of Asthma, Allergy and Immunology, and has served as an editor consultant and a reviewer of various medical journals. She is an author of 4 chapters in the books, has 12 publications and 37 publications. She is currently working for Advocate Aura Health for the past 8 years, and we all know her. Welcome, Dr. Monica, for your presentation on the topic.
Thank you, Saurabh. I'll share my presentation now. I want to say thank you to everybody again for an opportunity to share my thoughts and summary of what's been happening as news has become rapidly changing. And it's always nice to be able to be part of a esteemed group of colleagues to have a discussion about drastically changing scenarios regarding the vaccine. And I titled this, we're using one of the slogans that has been used to motivate others to get vaccinated, because I really feel that this is one of many slogans that really embodies why we talk about vaccines consistently. And this really is our shot to not only get out of this pandemic, but also to change the world. What I'd like to do today is to provide an update on boosters, kids, and equity. And I want to thank you again for your time and commitment to be part of this forum today. I always like to start with this slide and to explain why we are getting immunizations. When approaching patients and addressing some of the barriers earlier on in the vaccination drive as to why they had not received the immunization, including fellow colleagues, they said, well, I was infected. I was infected in the second surge. I was infected in the first surge. Let's save the vaccines for others who need it because I have immunity. Well, yes, when you do get infected, you do develop natural immunity. And this is depicted in the first tree on the left, where you have branches of memory B cells, antibodies, CD4 T lymphocytes, and CD8 T lymphocytes. Natural immunity can be robust. We also know that it's variable. And when you have immunity, it is across the entire virion as opposed to what our immunization does. And what does vaccine immunity do? It induces immunity mostly directed to the spike protein, which you have heard about. And as depicted in this diagram, you can see that this tree is a little bit larger. We know that vaccine immunity tends to be stronger, it tends to be homogeneous compared to that of natural immunity, which again was variable. So what happens if we get natural immunity followed by vaccine immunity? We got infected before the vaccine was available. We got the vaccine or vice versa. We now have what's known as hybrid immunity. And this hybrid immunity has been shown to be 25 to 100 times more than the responses regarding antibody, B cells, and CD4 T cells than of either one alone. So there is a benefit to having natural immunity plus vaccine immunity to achieve hybrid immunity. We think most of our cells are in the vaccine immunity group where we've not been infected. That immunity is still existent. This is better than no immunity, but this is specifically to address why herd immunity, which is vaccination against a community, is really important, and this hybrid immunity is particularly desirable. This also goes by the term of superimmunity. Superimmunity can refer to some people who mount the extraordinary powerful immune responses to natural infection. That represents the variation that I talked about in terms of natural infection, or those who've had hybrid exposure to the virus. And those who were likely infected earlier on in the pandemic, likely with the Alpha variant, and then they were immunized with one of the two mRNA vaccines that have been available this past year. This is another one of my favorite slides, and it is a very eloquent diagram summarizing the various platforms used for the various vaccines that are present worldwide. We have our DNA-based vaccines, such as Sanofi and Inovio. They require a device to help set the vaccine into the cells. There are the RNA vaccines that we have been hearing quite a bit about because they've undergone the most rigorous of studies that have been published recently. They include the Pfizer, Moderna in the United States. We also have the inactivated vaccines, which is your Sinopharm and Sinovac from China. These are inactivated vaccines of the whole virus. You also have the well-studied viral vector vaccines. This is your AstraZeneca vaccine, your Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That's a single dose here. There was also one Merck and the CanSino Bio that had developed these vector vaccines. And what they do here is they insert a gene for a viral protein into another, which delivers the protein to the vaccine recipient. The subunit vaccines are not available yet, but are undergoing trials. Clover is from China, and then you also have Novavax. And we had preliminary data that was even available as early as June from the United States and Mexico regarding Novavax, that was highly effective in preventing infection, as well as against the variants. This is yet to be even submitted to the FDA. I've not heard anything yet about Novavax, but these are vaccines to definitely keep our eyes and ears open for. So this introduces a fragment of the virus into the body. It's enough to be recognized by the immune response and stimulate immunity. This is a platform that has well been established in our vaccine world. And then you have the live attenuated vaccines. This is just a refresher to show you that when you develop antibodies to the spike protein, and this is a diagram of the spike protein, that if you have natural immunity, you can be developing antibodies to any component of this. When you hear about developing antibodies to the receptor binding domain, this is the most important part of the spike protein, and that's referenced as RBD in the studies that you might see. What are the vaccines that are in development? This is a slide that was updated as of Friday, September 24th. What you can see is there are 121 vaccines in clinical development, 194 in preclinical development. What are the different platforms? They're listed in the bottom left here, where you can see anything from protein subunit to RNA. to virus-like particles. And then if you're looking at how these vaccines are administered, there's a single dose for 19 vaccines, 2 doses for 74 vaccines that can be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks apart. There's 1 vaccine in development that is 3 doses. And then you have 3 vaccines with oral administration, and then you have the various injectable routes that are being shown here. So there are many more vaccines that are being developed right now. What are we in the state of vaccination status in the world? I will refer to this again in the future. The UAE leads with 94% receiving at least part immunization. So those in the dark green bars have received the complete immunization of the series, where the lighter green at the end represents they're still yet to receive the second dose if they're a 2-dose vaccine series. And this represents a percentage of the population against the x-axis. And what you can see here is that the numbers trail all the way down to like Tanzania, which is less than 1%. So there is a discrepancy in the percentage of people across countries in this world. There are many data to show the efficacy of vaccines, and I'm just showing you this as a representative. This was posted as a preprint looking at COVID-associated hospitalization rates among adults between January and July. So this is when vaccines were starting to be rolled out. What you're seeing on the blue line are those that are being hospitalized per 100,000 population. In the light green is the number of people who were vaccinated. The blue are those who are unvaccinated. The lowest number was in the highest age group, which is greater than 65, and this likely represents the appearance of the vaccines for this age group. You had your initial vaccine that was rolled out to those healthcare workers and high-risk individuals. Then it progressed to those that were 65 and older, and then it progressed down in age. And that's why you see those that were between 50 to 64 and 18 to 49 were higher in terms of hospitalizations if they were unvaccinated. What about variants? This was a preprint again. This was published recently, I believe last week. And what you're seeing here is a hazard ratio. How many times more is your risk of hospitalization if you got the Gamma variant versus the Beta versus the Delta? And what you can see is that the Gamma not only is the most transmissible of the variants, but it's also been associated with the highest hazard ratio between closer to 3 if you have the Gamma compared to if you had the Kappa, which was between 1 and 2. So that is your rate of hospitalization based on variant. Now let's look at the hospitalization rate based on those who've been vaccinated. Now this was looking at data in the state of Washington, and they chose to compare those who were not vaccinated versus those who were 21 days post-vaccination. This is because they were looking at those who were hospitalized, assuming that they were infected 2 weeks after their second dose, and it took about 7 days from the time of the onset of infection to hospitalization. The first of the 2 data points shows you 21 days after the first dose, or the second data point, which is no vaccination or less than 21 days after the first dose. And what you can see with the Delta variant is that the hospitalization ratio decreases from 2.5 to less than 1. For the Gamma variant, it decreases for less than 3 to closer to 1. And for the Alpha variant, it drops from 2 to less than 1. So not only are we seeing that the hospitalization hazard ratios are different for different variants, but we see across the board, no matter what variant you get, that there's a decrease in the hospitalization hazard ratio 21 days following the first dose of immunization. So we know that these immunizations work. So that was looking at hospitalization rates. What about infections? And this is, again, just another representative diagram in terms of vaccine effectiveness in preventing infection. And you can see that it is close to like 90 to 100% here, depending on the different studies we're looking at versus of different vaccines as well, whether it be Pfizer or Moderna. And the second thing I want to show you is that the effectiveness remains steady for many months, but then look, it starts to drop. And so we know that these vaccines are efficacious, but it also is going to lose some of its effectiveness with time. And that's my segue to talk about boosters. When I originally showed this slide many, many months ago, we weren't even talking about boosters. And I thought this was a very premature slide, but we are here now and we are talking about boosters, and the conversation is on everybody's priority list. So the Pfizer vaccine has received booster authorization in the US. And let me describe this, where we are with this. So again, to show you additional data, this has been posted by the CDC. And what this looked at was the efficacy against hospitalizations who are immunocompetent by vaccine product. And this is in 21 hospitals. And what they looked at was Moderna, they looked at Pfizer, and they looked at Johnson & Johnson. And I'm drawing your attention here to the Pfizer data. In the Pfizer data, between 14 to 120 days after full vaccination, the efficacy against hospitalization was 91%. But greater than 120 days after full vaccination, the efficacy drops 14% to 77%. So we're starting to see that after a period of 120 days that you are now getting increase in hospitalization rates. Now let's look at severe illness. In those people who received the booster dose, and those were 60 and older, they said that there was a 19.5 adjusted rate ratio in terms of preventing severe illnesses in those who received a booster dose compared to those that did not receive a booster dose. So you had 294 cases in the non-booster case compared to 29 cases of the booster dose. So again, we can see that the Pfizer provides benefit, and this is from the Israeli data. So what was this Israeli study? They looked at 12 days after the booster dose. The rate of confirmed infection was lower in the booster group than in the non-booster group by a factor of 11.3. The rate of severe illness was lower by a factor of 19.5, and that was a slide that I just showed you prior to this. In a secondary analysis, the rate of confirmed infection at least 12 days after vaccination was lower than the rate after 4 to 6 days by a factor of 5.4. So rate of infection, severe illness was lower in those who received the booster dose. This is a diagram from their New England publication. And what you're seeing here in the dotted line is days since booster vaccination and the reduction in infection rate. So the dotted line represents those who've not received the booster, and there is no change in their reduction of infection rate. The larger the bar, the greater the reduction in infection rate. So as you are progressing from your days post-booster vaccination, so you can see here starting from day 9 and extending upwards, you are seeing that you are now decreasing your rate of infection by that much more from the booster. So this is the data from Israel. We don't have such great data for Moderna, or we don't have such great data from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but this is really the data that was used to look at for boosters. This was a paper that was published in the New England Journal on October the 6th, and this is coming out of Qatar. And what you're seeing here is effectiveness against any SARS-CoV-2 infection in panel A, or against severe critical or fatal disease in panel B. And these are days after your vaccine dose. So 0 to 13 days after the first dose is your first data point, greater than 14 days is your second data point. And you can see that the vaccine effectiveness against any SARS-CoV-2 infection rises up 77, 73.2%, 69%. And then look what happened after month 4. You're seeing that now the vaccine effectiveness is now decreased to 22, 17, and 22%. What about fatal cases? You're seeing that there are protection, and it's a little bit more preserved until about 6 months, and then you're seeing a little bit of a drop here. So what this tells me is that the vaccine is effective for quite some time for preventing severe critical or fatal cases of COVID-19, but you lose your effectiveness for in reinfection or infection a lot sooner. And we're seeing that as we're seeing numbers of COVID cases in those who have been previously immunized. So what was the timeline of events that led to the booster recommendation in the United States? On the 17th of September, the FDA Advisory Committee, so this is a committee that advises the FDA called VRBPAC, Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, on the booster dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. They voted against a booster dose for those that are 16 and older, and that was 16-2. And they voted in favor of those that were 65 and older, those judged to be high risk of COVID-19 6 months after the initial vaccine, and that was a unanimous vote. However, they also said healthcare workers and others at high risk for occupational exposure should also receive this as well, and that they were in the process of evaluating the data of 1 million people who've already received a booster dose in the US. Then on September 22nd, the FDA releases this press release. FDA authorizes booster dose of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for certain populations, and you can see the list here: 65 and older, 18 to 64 at high risk for COVID-19, 18 to 64 who require frequent institutional occupational exposure that makes them at high risk for severe complications, including severe COVID-19. Then on September 23rd, the next day, the CDC Advisory Committee on the Immunization Practices, the ACIP, recommended booster doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and they voted unanimously again to recommend 65 and older. So this doesn't seem to be an area of discussion. Everyone seems to be on the same page about this. They voted 13 in the majority to give a single booster dose to those who are between 50 and 64 with certain high risk conditions. 9-6 in favor of booster dose for people 18 to 49 with underlying medical conditions. And they surprisingly voted against recommending a booster dose for people 18 to 64 who are at risk for COVID-19 due to health, occupation, or living situation, and that would be us, healthcare workers. Then September 24th, the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, she overruled this panel and said that people at COVID-19 infection who are at risk of this infection because of their job should be eligible for a booster. So, and all of a sudden we became eligible. And just to show you the difference in recommendations in immunizations, booster doses for all Americans versus all Americans 65 and older, those with underlying medical conditions, and those working at high risk jobs, that the recommendations became very scattered among these different bodies that were issuing the recommendations. However, the CDC final and definitive recommendation are for those who are 65 and older, those with medical conditions, and those working in high-risk jobs. So my colleagues who have received the Pfizer vaccine are eligible for a booster dose. So what about the story about the Moderna? So the Moderna dose is actually much higher than that of the Pfizer. And it's a 2-dose vaccine given 4 weeks apart. And we know that there were a lot of side effects associated with this vaccine series. The FDA will be hearing information next week, I believe, regarding the authorization of the Moderna booster at half the dose. And so that would also allow there to be more vaccine available for boosters. What about Johnson & Johnson? We do see that antibody levels have also fallen with Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I've not shown that data. They supported data. They have data to support boosting at single dose. And I think because this was the single dose vaccine, they didn't have a chance even in their initial series to get a booster, that this is also a vaccine that should, we will be hearing soon about getting a booster. I do feel that a booster will become available for all the vaccines that are currently available, and not sure how this will look or when it will become available. This is just a very simple graphic to show those countries. And again, this is not inclusive of all the countries that have allowed booster doses that are 65 and older. That may or may not include healthcare workers, and this list will continue to grow. Where are we right now in terms of those who received at least one booster dose? We can see about 78%. I'd like to give a word about vaccine mandates, because one of the issues that we have been dealing with vaccine hesitancy is the issuance of vaccine mandates. And we saw that with Biden's recent initiative. So George Washington and the Continental Army, they faced a threat that was deadlier than the British in the first years of the Revolutionary War. And that was the smallpox, the frequent outbreaks, and wariness to inoculation made his troops susceptible to disease. So after heavy losses in Boston and Quebec, Washington implemented the first mass immunization in American history. And this shows you a picture of in 1802 where Jenner is administering the cowpox vaccine, and you're seeing these women showing that they're scared and they're growing cow parts from their bodies. And then this illustrates the fear that was associated with vaccinations. So what we are seeing today, what we talk about today is nothing new. This is something that we have faced in history, and this is history repeating itself. So what are these vaccine mandates? On September 9th, there was new federal vaccine requirements for as many 100 million Americans to increase their vaccinations and curb the surging Delta variant. Biden sharply criticized the tens of millions of Americans who were not vaccinated despite months of availability and incentives. And I think this speaks to two issues. One is that we had a very communicable Delta variant, and two, we're now seeing the waning of the immunizations and those who received their shots in December, January, February of this year. So what can we do to really maintain this community or herd immunity? And that was through these mandates. In September 15th, the LA Board of Education voted to require students 12 and older to be vaccinated if they attend in-person classes. And this is the nation's second largest school district. Then October 1st, Governor Gavin Newsom announced a vaccine mandate for students aged 12 and older, making California the first state in the nation to require students to be fully vaccinated for in-person instruction. What was the mandate that Biden recommended? That employers with 100 or more employees will be required to have their employees be fully vaccinated or get tested weekly to come to work. Federal workers and employees of contractors that do business with the federal government need to be vaccinated. Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, will require vaccinations in their Head Start programs, as well as schools run by the Department of Defense and Bureau of Indian Education. Workers in healthcare facilities that receive federal dollars through Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, including hospitals and home health agencies, will be vaccinated. And individuals applying to become lawful permanent U.S. residents must be fully vaccinated effective October 1st. And this was announced on September 14th. This is a graphic that I created of the logos of some of the many different companies that are requiring or have vaccine mandates in place. I also put this slide in to show you it's not just about vaccine mandates, but it's about mask mandates. And like I had alluded to in the past, that the sentiment to vaccine was met with distrust in history, so has masks. And this is just a nice illustration to show what we have faced in the past in our history. I love this cartoon, this poster to encourage parents to have their children immunized. And I feel like this poster would still have relevance today. So let's talk about our children. And this is a big topic. This is an important topic. This represents an important demographic where we have our children going back to school. What you can see here is a number of cases of children in the United States that have been infected. And those of you who have seen a few of my prior talks have seen that there's a progression now in this wave that you can see on the extreme right. What you see on the extreme right is the beginning of school. We start our new academic cycle in the southern states in August and in the northern states in September. And you can see that there is a rise in the cases, and now they're beginning to fall down a little bit. In terms of, those in the light blue are adult cases, and those in the dark navy blue are your child cases. And then looking specifically at your child cases of the number of children that were sick in the past week, you can see that there was 173,000 as of September 30th. What do we know about kids that have been infected? And that is that in states where you have increase in overall vaccination rates, you will have less children who will have COVID-19. And so even though not all kids have been getting vaccinated if they're 12 and older, kids are still benefiting from adults who are getting vaccinated. And this is showing you the correlation again of the rates of infections in kids per 100,000 versus percentage of the population that is fully vaccinated. This doesn't represent all the states. Again, there's no data available for the states listed below, but I think that this is a very beautiful relationship that has been demonstrated. So what do we know about vaccination in children? In the US, vaccination is available for those 16 and older since April of 2021. On May 10th, the FDA extended the emergency use authorization to the Pfizer-BioNTech to those who are 12 to 15 years of age. They had reported a 100% efficacy in phase 3 data in preventing COVID-19 disease in this group. There is a teen trial called the COVE trial for the Moderna that showed 93.3% efficacy 14 days after the second dose in those 12 to 17. The EUA was submitted in June of 2021. And there's a Novavax trial that enrolled 2248 participants aged 12 to 17 in mid-June 2021. So let's look at those who are 12 and older, and what you're seeing that as of August 13th, you can see, as of September 30th, that there are 75.5% of those in the United States who are 12 and older who have received at least one dose. And that's much better than the adult vaccination rate, which is 64.6, excluding those 65 and older. In terms of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the adult dose is 30 milligrams. The child dose is 10 milligrams, 1/3 the dose in those who are 5 to 11. They conducted a clinical trial of 2268 children. So this is the data that's being presented to the FDA right now. And they were given 2 doses 3 days apart. And it was done in a 2-to-1 randomization where 2 children got the dose where 1 got a placebo. Instead of looking at illness, hospitalization, and fatality as a primary outcome, they assessed antibody levels. What they found was a high level of neutralizing antibodies comparable to levels seen in older children. That was the 16 to 25 who received the higher dose of the 30 milligram. And there were no reported cases of myocarditis. Now, I have to let you know that this is 2,200 children compared to the 40,000 people that were studied with our initial Pfizer and Moderna studies. Those studies were done over months of research, and this study was done over 2 months. So what you see here are the different press releases related to this data. On September 20th, Pfizer announced that the COVID vaccine is safe and effective for those that are 5 to 11. Then what you see is that on September 28th, they share the data with the FDA regarding their findings on this age group. And then what you're seeing here now is that this is information that is as of yesterday, that Pfizer asked the FDA to authorize its COVID-19 vaccine for 5 to 11. And a decision is set to come soon after October 31st. And I found this cartoon. So any thoughts about what you'd like to be for Halloween? And I'd like the FDA approved to get the vaccine. So I think this cartoon actually had quite the insight and foresight. I want to talk about vaccinating the world and equity. This requires a conversation or understanding of what COVAX is. And if I may, I'd like to share this video. Please let me know if you can't see it or can't hear it.
Policy, with the largest portfolio of when the world has safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines, how can we make sure they reach the people that need them most? Today, there are many vaccines in development. Most will fail. For those that could succeed, Governments are under pressure to secure supplies for their populations. If governments compete for vaccines, most countries could miss out. This is not only bad for countries that cannot secure their own supplies, it's bad for us all, as no one is safe until everyone is safe. The COVAX pillar aims to ensure that every country gets fair and equitable access to eventual COVID-19 vaccines. It does this by acting as an insurance policy with the largest portfolio of vaccine candidates in the world. Wealthier countries have a greater chance of gaining access to successful vaccines. And by pooling their buying power rather than competing against one another, they enable investment in factories. So more doses are available as soon as a vaccine becomes available. The COVAX pillar is founded on the principle of equitable access. This means any country, regardless of their ability to pay, has the same access to vaccines. By supporting the development and manufacturing of these vaccines, wealthy countries increase their chances of getting COVID-19 vaccines and ensure the rest of the world gets access too. Ending the pandemic as quickly as possible will take a global effort. We need as many doses as possible, as fast as possible, as soon as a safe and effective vaccine becomes available. 2 billion doses would be enough to vaccinate healthcare workers and other high-risk groups. If we start now, we can save hundreds of thousands of lives, not to mention trillions of dollars. It's not about one country versus another. It's about one world protected.
Thank you. So where are we in terms of vaccination? And this is data as of October 7th, where the shades of green represent the percentage of the population that is vaccinated in that country, where the darker the color, the more vaccinated the country is. And what we continue to see is the disparity of those who are fully vaccinated or who have a higher level of vaccination. And I've been looking at this graph almost like every week. And I think in the last few weeks, this has not budged very much. And I'm waiting to see some of these lighter colors turn darker. So there is not equal and equitable access at this point. And what do we know in terms of what are the different vaccines that have been distributed? This was published in Nature. And what you are seeing is that there's also a difference in the types of the vaccine platforms that have been available in these countries. In the higher income countries, you're seeing a much larger amount of the mRNA and a smaller amount of your viral vector, that's your Johnson & Johnson. And then in your upper middle income countries, you are seeing a little bit more of an equal distribution. And COVAX, which really is trying to allow a more equal distribution. And in the upper middle income countries, in the lower middle income countries and the low income countries, they are heavily dependent on the viral vector vaccines. So this was on September 22nd, and Biden calls for the global share targets to vaccinate 70% of the world's population across all income brackets by September of 2022. So that's quite some time away. And then this is news from like 24 hours ago when the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appealed for $8 billion to help equitable distribution to vaccinate 40% of all people in all countries by the end of this year. So he set a little bit of a lower target. So he went from like 70% to 40%, but he also made it by the end of this year. So there have been efforts to make vaccine access more equitable. And this was brand new news as well. This was also published on the 7th of October, where the Moderna plans to build, or they had a press release that they were going to build an mRNA vaccine manufacturing plant in Africa. We're not sure where, we're not sure when, and that they said that they were going to invest $500 million into the facility. What's another issue that is preventing, once the vaccines are distributed, this is news from October 6th, is that there's a global syringe shortage, which would specifically prevent the vaccinations. And then they had talked about Pfizer BioNTech as the vaccine that they could not administer. So it's really, there's multiple moving parts in why vaccines have not become available, and it is being recognized as something that needs to be addressed, and it's just not happening fast enough. So what are the future directions? We all need to work towards combating disinformation. We had no idea when this vaccine initiative started what the arguments and counter arguments would be when it came to addressing those who were hesitant. I remember talking to colleagues who had received the vaccination against the swine flu in 2009, and there was really no conversation. We all got the vaccine in 2009 against swine flu, and it was done. And yet, with these vaccines that have been found to be so efficacious, there has been much more animosity and much more information from those who have not been vaccinated. This doesn't discount the millions and billions of people who have stood in line, made sacrifices to get the vaccines, dealt with side effects. And I have had patients who have had adverse reactions to the vaccine and said, just treat me through that second dose because I want that second dose. So we're seeing the full spectrum in terms of people's attitudes towards the vaccine. Again, looking at equitable access, we discussed quite a bit about boosters. We know that these conversations will be happening at the FDA next week. The other point that I didn't talk about is that mixing and matching of vaccines received a lot of attention in other countries, but not in the United States. I felt like the approach in the United States was pretty, pure. You had to stick with the vaccine that you'd gotten the first and second dose to. But we do know that viral vector vaccine followed by mRNA. So if you get the AstraZeneca followed by the Pfizer, that you make a really good antibody response. Could that be true for getting the Johnson & Johnson followed by Pfizer or Moderna? They'll also be discussing the mixing of the vaccines next week. Future directions is vaccine mandates and how many more companies are going to require them, and how is it going to spread to other things that we do on a day-to-day basis, entering and eating in food establishments, staying in hotels, traveling, things like that. We had a case here of a patient who in the Southeast who was denied a kidney transplant because they were not vaccinated. So what is going to be the distribution or access of healthcare for those who are vaccinated and those who are not? The other thing when it comes to dealing with this pandemic, which I think I have not spent enough time to talk about because I've talked a lot about vaccines, is that to get an effective handle on knowing where we are in terms of infection risk and transmissibility risk is that we need to know if we're infected. We are now coming in a situation of having a twindemic of the seasonal influenza versus COVID. And not every fever is COVID. So being able to have access to point of care testing that you can do home, that may not be 100% in terms of accuracy, but it gives us some information for those of us that need to reduce our risk in terms of going to work or being around other family members. What about COVID and pregnant people? Only 30% of US pregnant women are vaccinated, whether or not they got vaccinated prior to the pregnancy or during their vaccination. We know that vaccination is safe in pregnancy, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has published their guidelines regarding vaccination, but it's stated everywhere that please have a conversation with your doctor. I've heard of cases within my hospital system where there are women who are in their second trimester who are unvaccinated and who are intubated. It is very, very devastating to hear these stories, especially when you know that vaccination could have prevented this. What about COVID in patients who have HIV and even access to routine HIV care during COVID? Are they getting their retroviral therapies? Are they being able to be treated for other infections? What about the next viruses to worry about? We know that there are emerging viruses in Laos and China in bat caves. What's going to happen with that? What about antibodies? We have seen, excuse me?
Hello, Nicole.
we've seen antibodies, and there's calls for affordability and access. And I just make a quick mention about the Merck pill and making sure that we have more therapies. So talking about vaccine also means that we should be talking about therapies. I talked about the 5 to 11 age group, and then I think we need more information about long COVID as well. So I know I discussed a lot of topics in these future direction slides that I think that are open topics for discussion. But the final word is that we really need to have multiple layers. It wasn't just the vaccine. The vaccine wasn't go get your vaccine and 2 weeks after your vaccine, go take your mask off and give your grandmother a hug. It was about, in addition to your vaccine, continue to make smart choices in terms of social isolation versus going into safe areas and what you do. And I think this is where the messaging needs to be: mask, test, vaccinate, make the right choices in what you do, and we will get through this together. I know I've gotten over my time today. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I do hope that I was able to share some information or insight as to what is happening right now and the current state of vaccines. And thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will open the floor for the question answers. Please raise your hand so that I can invite you to ask questions. Yes, Dr. Akhtar Hussain.
Thank you very much, Monica Vasudeva. That's a very, very good, excellent presentation. My question is, did we fail to put the trust in our world community for vaccine? Because we have talked so much hesitancy, but what I feel my patients are communities, they don't trust on vaccine. What are the reasons?
Well, we have the most absurd to the very understanding. So I will become magnetized. I will become infertile. There's a computer chip in the vaccine, or the conspiracy theories. We'll put those aside. I think the hesitancy came from many different issues. I think that, especially in the United States, the vaccine came on the heels of a contested election. And the vaccines first became available while the elections were going on. I mean, when the elections had the results had come out and we were still waiting for the change of presidency. And I think that people were exhausted. I think people were exhausted about the pandemic, that they weren't out of it. And they equated not wanting the vaccine as a way of making a decision and taking control of what they wanted to do in a world that they had lost control. That is my personal philosophical thought as to why they didn't want the vaccine. And then it just caught a lot of steam. I think people who were talking about other therapies felt that there was a conspiracy in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, and that there wasn't enough time and attention given to other therapies. I believe that they felt that Operation Warp Speed, which was a term that was used to talk about the distribution of the vaccines, conferred a notion that the vaccines were made too quickly, not understanding that pandemic guidelines for vaccine development do not skip steps. It's telescoped the timing of different steps of the different parts of vaccine development. And if not anything, I believe that these vaccines underwent greater scrutiny than other vaccines that we had present. They felt that the mRNA vaccine was novel, not realizing that it had been studied in Africa for 10 years before it was used for the mRNA vaccine. When it comes to hesitation, some of them thought that it was expensive, that they would have to pay for it. Some of them didn't want to take a day off from work, so that they heard about people who felt very fatigued for days after the second dose, especially the Moderna dose. Many different reasons. Those are the ones that I'm listing off, are the things that my patients have told me.
Can I invite Dr. Salma Kundi from Pakistan to ask question?
Good morning. Since I joined late, I don't know whether you've discussed it or not, but Monica, you were saying that in October, you'll be more clear about the third booster dose. Can you give us some information? Who should get it? Because the whole population can't. Is it only for travelers, people going to other countries? And which dose, which regime would you recommend? Mix and match or the same vaccine that we had the last 2 times? Thank you.
So, yeah, no problem. Thank you. That's a great question.
Excuse me. Can I add the supplementary question with this? Can I add, Saurabh?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very, very informative presentation, Monica. I missed 10 minutes of your last presentation because of my patient's commitment. But I heard about your booster dose. What my president, Dr. Salma Kundi said, I just add on in that in Pakistan, the Pakistani people had the Chinese vaccine. I have a Sinopharm 2 dose. But now the government has announced that all the health workers should have a booster dose. And the booster dose is available in Pakistan is Pfizer. So what do you think? What do you think? Is it a good thing to have this booster dose of all the healthcare workers of Pfizer vaccine after having a Chinese 2 dose of Chinese Sinopharm and Sinovac? So is it a good, as my president asked about the mismatch and everything? This is all about. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is a great question. And so I'm just going to show again what these vaccine platforms are. I'm sorry, my Zoom thing is in the way here. Okay, so the original question is what are the vaccines that you recommend? What were you talking about in terms of the end of October? And that was regarding the recommendations for the EUA for those 5 to 11. So we're talking about 2 different things here. One is we're talking about vaccinations in younger children. And the second thing we're talking about is boosters. The data for the children have gone to the FDA already. This is 5 to 11. This is 1/3 the dose. This was looking at antibody responses. This was looking in about 2,000 kids. This was a 2-month study that it was safe and that they had high antibody levels, neutralizing antibody levels that was compared to those who were 16 to 25 years of age. So I do expect that decision by the FDA will be made by October or November, which is typically when we receive the seasonal influenza immunization in the US. So when it comes to approaching febrile illnesses in the winter season, getting vaccinated with a combination of the flu vaccine, as well as having the COVID vaccine now available, Pfizer, to younger children will be beneficial for school-going children. Okay, let's put that one aside. Now let's talk about getting vaccines in mixing and matching combinations with booster doses. Now, we know that the healthcare worker population is susceptible and at higher risk for being exposed by virtue of seeing symptomatic people. Those who are seeking healthcare, even if they don't think that they have COVID, may be carrying the vaccine. And we are in a position where we see or are approached by patients who are not vaccinated. Okay. So if you receive the initial series of your vaccine, what we have seen, what we can extrapolate from other studies that I have shown you, is that the antibody levels will fall. Your rate of being able to protect against infection will fall. We know that there is preserved ability to prevent severe disease and hospitalization, as we saw from the most recent Qatar study. However, we see that there is a waning of efficacy of our vaccines. Now, what about mixing and matching? The mixing and matching of vaccines we saw from the European, the English data, where they had AstraZeneca, which was your viral vector, right? So they used the viral vector platform, and they followed it up with the Pfizer, which is your RNA Pfizer, and they had robust responses. So we know that viral vector followed by an RNA vaccine is efficacious. Now you received Sinovac and Sinopharm, which is an inactivated vaccine. So this is a platform in the bottom left. My understanding, based on what I have seen and what my extrapolation is based on the data that's been shown, is that if you are being offered an RNA vaccine as a booster following an inactivated vaccine, which is a different platform, I think this is fantastic. One of the things that was being discussed, at least on our end, is that Moderna and Johnson & Johnson have not received authorization for booster yet. And one of the conversations that's happening in the US now is finally of mixing and matching. So if I have a patient that received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I would actually recommend that they get the Pfizer vaccine as opposed to a booster with the Johnson & Johnson. So in Pakistan, if you've received the Sinopharm and Sinovac, and they're recommending that you get the Pfizer, I think that is a very good recommendation. And that is what I would recommend myself. So that's
Thank
a
you
long
very much,
answer to
Monica.
that.
Great. As usual, you are a very good presenter. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question. I'm wondering if you could type it out if it's possible.
Yeah, I think your connection was wrong. It's not, the network is down. Ravi, I think you were asking a question, Ravi?
Yes. Thank you. Wonderful presentation as usual, Dr. Monica. We always love listening to you. I was actually going to ask about the 5 to 12 years old, which actually you have already sort of said that the FDA is now in the process. But in your personal opinion, from your personal experience, what do you think about the 5 to 12 years old? Because they all have to go back to school. And what is their status going to be actually?
Yes, great question. Okay. So there's some people who will stand in line and they'll say, I want to get the vaccine right away. What if you have an 11-and-a-half-year-old? Would you want them to get the 1/3 dose, or would you have them wait 6 months and get the full dose? I don't know. That is an answer so that's one scenario that I thought of when this came out. And if my child was in the 5 to 11, I would wait. I would wait a month or two, and I'd wait to see, because the data that came from the studies was based on 2 months of studies. I think it's safe. I think if your child is in a high-risk environment, if they're in a school, there's no masks, there is surging, you want to really send your child to school, I would get the vaccine. If you have the luxury of time, then I would wait and see. Wait for a population to start getting vaccinated to see what the outcome is. And especially if you have a child that's close to 12, I would prefer getting the full dose of the Pfizer vaccine.
Monica, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I noticed that the study for 5 to 12 was based on neutralizing antibodies as opposed to, is there a weakness in the protocol of the study?
I do not think so. I just think that kids don't get as sick as adults. And I think because they know that the vaccine is efficacious. I think the biggest issue is that they were looking at kids as being vectors of the virus to others in the household. So why vaccinate, a population that is relatively otherwise well and doesn't get hospitalized, is because you're really trying to prevent transmission of the disease. So I think it was pretty elegant to look at antibody levels as opposed to as a primary endpoint. But my issue is that I think we just need a little bit more information, a little bit more time. When you look at the original Pfizer and Moderna studies, there was a lot more patients that were included from many more geographic areas. And so we had a much better understanding.
Yep.
Yeah.
What about the level of antibodies that they used? Was there a cutoff for neutralizing antibodies?
Great question. I don't know that information. I don't know if they released that or not.
Because it wasn't apparent. It wasn't apparent in the paper, I think.
Yeah. Because I'm always looking to see what is a good protective antibody level. All they said was that it was comparable to that between that 16 to 25 age group, unless I missed it.
Yeah, because we're all talking about correlates of protection now, right? I mean, you're trying to find some sort of correlate of protection.
Yes.
I think, Dr. Monica, I think the skill sharing should be just stopped.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I have a question?
Yes, Dr. Chaudhary.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, Dr. Monica, you are showing that this Moderna is planning to establish this vaccine plant in Africa with an amount of $600 million. Actually, actually, I heard it several months before. Is it already started or just they're planning? It's still in the planning phase.
I will actually put the link of the news where I got this information from, and so that you can see that. It was just that I was trying to find what are ways that we can make sure that we have equitable distribution of the vaccine. And I thought that this was a very interesting piece of news as to how we can make it equitable. It's to actually get the production plant in Africa.
Okay, another question is actually you are showing the Pfizer vaccine after 6 months, it comes down to 78% efficacy. So it's quite enough actually to be actually the other vaccines actually having the same range of efficacy. So why in US or rather they are just thinking to this booster in this cases actually in the vulnerable groups? Why? Because Sinopharm, Sinovac, all these things, all these vaccines are recognized and endorsed by the WHO, having their range in the range of 78, 82, something like that. So why we are thinking for, and another thing, sir, that Sinopharm and Sinovac, they are not actually showing any sort of trial results regarding the booster.
Yeah, so I haven't seen any data regarding Johnson & Johnson, and I haven't seen any data on Moderna, but all the information regarding booster is in the last 3 weeks. So even if there's no data right now, that does not mean that there may not be data that's submitted soon. And it depends on what your ability to collect the data is in the countries that these boosters are being released. I mean, these vaccines are being released, that you'll understand about boosters. But I do feel that the information we're getting from Pfizer and the data that was collected originally from Israel is now being extrapolated across all the different vaccine platforms, even if it's not specifically to one. And then regarding like even in Pakistan about getting the original vaccine and then getting a different vaccine for a booster, we're now extrapolating that from the mixing and matching data of the initial vaccine series from England. So there's been so many combinations and permutations of these vaccines that we don't know. All we know is that in those people who receive 2 doses of the same vaccine, that we are seeing that the antibody levels are decreasing with time. And we are in a scenario now where we're in a more communicable variant with the Delta variant still leading the pack. So given these scenarios, we have to make decisions about protecting our healthcare workers in the next potential surge. If we catch up now, maybe this will all become a moot point, right? Maybe, we're seeing the US cases have come down like 25% in the last week. Maybe we're in the right curve right now. We don't know.
Dr. Pillai here. The talk has been excellent and very informative. One or two queries. One is that what we find is that those people after vaccination come with problems. It do occur about the second week, 14 days or that range. And those with neurological problems, I'm a neurosurgeon, neurological problems, we find that the antibody level is very high, 3,000, 4,000, that sort of range. So the booster dose when you take, do you have to check the antibody level of the person before doing it? That is one question. Second is, of course, by 14 days and all, you have the thrombotic episodes. So is it necessary to do D-dimer in those cases so that and non-heparin anticoagulants, we can use them?
These are great questions. So when it comes to the procoagulant vaccines, those are based on the viral vector vaccines, your AstraZeneca and your Johnson & Johnson. When it comes to your protocol for looking at D-dimer, that could be based on the patient's symptoms. I don't have that much experience with the viral vector because I hardly deal with Johnson & Johnson. It really is not a very, it's not a very popular vaccine here. When it comes to looking at antibody levels for those people who you're looking at boosters, we do not check antibody levels in the US, but I think it is a fantastic idea. If you're trying to risk stratify patients with potential side effects of the vaccine, and if you look at vaccine antibody, or you're looking at antibody levels, I don't know what the antibody levels mean, but if you see it, there's a trend to a higher level with those who have side effects, then you can avoid the booster in that population. Or I recommend a non-vector based vaccine later on down the road when antibody levels fall.
Thank you.
Dr. Russell?
Monica, thank you very much. Lovely to listen to that again. I just wanted to ask you, the 5 to 11, the short study, 2-month study, you said that you thought it was safe. The 16, the other one has got some myocarditis, isn't it? Isn't that what we found between the 12 to 16? Isn't that what was found in the Pfizer? But in this group, there's no adverse events.
No adverse, no myocarditis.
But it was only 2 months. And yes. Do you think, because we are talking of a smaller, a younger age group, and if there is issues, I was just wondering what your thoughts were, given that 1-8 was a small group of 2,000 odd N subjects, and it was also shot only 2 months. My thoughts are the safety. How do we say, can we rely on that to say that it's safe?
So great question. I think the safety is because it was 1/3 the dose. The typical 12 and older was 30 milligrams, and this was 10 milligrams. The second thing about answering about safety, my personal approach is to wait for a month, wait to see as other kids get it if they do get it. But if you are in a high risk area and your child is exposed to unmasked, high density risk for exposure, I would get the vaccine. So that risk benefit ratio constantly changes based on your environment. And when I just gave you my initial thoughts about these vaccine, comparing it to the scenarios I was in when I was evaluating information regarding the other vaccines. But we know Pfizer is safe. We know that the most, publications have been on Pfizer. We know that they didn't have any myocarditis, which typically happens sooner or within those 2 months. So that's when I would be worried about the myocarditis. But I think that having good antibody levels and making sure that high risk children, if they want the vaccine, should be able to get it.
But Dr. Monica, but from Israel actually came to know long back that it causes myocarditis, which Pfizer denied. Actually, who should be the main body to just say correctly to us? Because in the Scandinavian countries, which I've seen, they are below 30, one country, and the other country below 18. They have stopped giving these jabs of Pfizer, Moderna.
I thought it was Moderna. Even I thought these Scandinavian countries were looking at 30 and under who.
Israel was talking about the Pfizer.
Oh, okay.
Israel, yes.
So when it comes to looking at adverse events, it requires a very close evaluation, understanding if the myocarditis is coming from infection versus immunization, right? Because we know that the myocarditis risk is much higher with the actual infection rather than the immunization. As drugs become available, as therapies become available, we get much better understanding post-release of medications about what the risk profile is. There are institutions and organizations in every country regarding the safety. Our FDA gives us our regulated data. We get black box warnings that come up many years after medications are released. So it is our duty to make sure that we understand what the risks are and we explain it to our patients. But the risk is not about vaccine or no vaccine. The conversation is the risk of vaccine versus risk of infection. So when I have the conversation about myocarditis with my patients, I'm not going to tell them the myocarditis risk is 0, but we know that the myocarditis risk, if you do get myocarditis, it's mild, it can be treated with NSAIDs, and most likely does not require hospitalization, versus those who get COVID-19 infection, that they have a risk of myocarditis as well. That's much higher.
Do you think that just last minute, right? There's a difference between the mRNA and the inactivated vaccines? Because in case of inactivated vaccines, we are not hearing anything about myocarditis.
Again, it depends on how good the reporting is. I think that there's much more robust data on Pfizer than there is about the others.
Dr. Angelica from South Africa.
Can I, Saurabh?
After Dr. Angelica, you can ask. Dr. Angelica?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Monica, again for an excellent presentation. I've got two questions, one observation and one question, but the question is, after you have been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and you are then in contact with a COVID-19 positive person, should you then again quarantine, or if not, for how long can you then more or less say you are safe and you don't need to quarantine in future if you are getting contact? And then the second thing, observation, I want to say, remember in our country, I have seen physically my patients, and I need to say to you that myocarditis complication from COVID-19 infection in my 50 pluses was a much more reality that I have seen and treated than we have seen with vaccinations. So and I think because a lot of the people saw patients via telemedicine, I don't think they picked it up that easily, because you can't. You have to physically examine the patient to pick up the myocarditis going on. So as Monica correctly said, the risk of getting myocarditis with COVID-19 are much higher than with any vaccine. Thank you.
That was a great question and great questions and comments. Thank you very much. So regarding if you've been immunized and you have a known exposure, if you are asymptomatic and you've been exposed while wearing PPE, you continue and you continue as normal. Once you become symptomatic, you isolate, you test, and once you test, then you remain in isolation. And I believe it's between 10 to 14 days, and I have to update that. I'm not sure at this point. I think because we've been vaccinated, and if we're asymptomatic, our policy in our hospital is not to get tested because we're all wearing PPE. And the assumption is that we did not get infected. Does that answer your question?
Great.
Thanks. Yes, Monica.
Yeah, Dr. Sajjad.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Saurabh. Monica, I just want to add my previous questions there. What do you think, that a booster dose should be a single dose of Pfizer, or it should be the complete 2 doses of boosters? Number one. And the other one is, I would like to reiterate my request again, which I have been requesting for many months, that the vaccine.
Dr. Sajjad, you lost me.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, my request is that the vaccine which is approved and recognized by the WHO should be accepted in all part of the world. And I have requested the CMAAO, particularly Dr. Chong is here. I requested that CMAAO should write a letter to the WHO or the different countries to accept all the vaccine which is being accepted by the WHO. And I think at that time, Dr. Jamal and everybody unanimously approved and accepted. So please, my request is to please write down something from the CMAAO.
Dr. Sajjad, just a minute. Actually, I have gone through this agenda of WMA. Okay, it is already there.
Yes, I know. Yes,
urgently it has been given. Yes, so it's not necessary again to go raise it from the CMAAO because it is already there. Yes.
Dr. Jamal, I have already written a letter to Dr. Otmore, and I have talked to him also personally to just include or talk about this serious issue.
It is included. It is included. I have seen it's included.
Yes, it is included. It is included. But my request is to also write down from. Okay, thank you very much. My question was that can the booster dose be given single double dose, Dr. Monica?
Single dose is okay. Single dose.
Single dose is okay. Not the 2 complete dose.
That is correct.
Okay.
Maybe you'll be knowing after 6 months again.
Yes. Then maybe we'll have something else, another different vaccine like Novavax available.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much.
So any other question on the floor? I don't see any hands raised. Dr. Chong, any questions? Because we can't take the country update. We just have 9 minutes. Otherwise, we'll close the session early.
Actually, not really. Sorry, I came rather late to the presentation. But it's just interesting because we are now struggling with boosting booster doses in Singapore because of our surge, and we've started with those above 60, now moving to those between 50 to 59. We have yet to announce boosters for healthcare workers yet. We're still going by age. So what are your thoughts on boosting for healthcare workers? We were one of the earliest to do so. We did it in January, February. So we're actually all overdue for boosting now. So what are your thoughts, Monica, on healthcare boosters?
So that's a great question. And that was the point of discussion in the United States in terms of the disparate recommendations. And I'm going to share my screen again because I believe that this is, it really embodies it from this. So I'm just going to scroll down to this slide right here. And so what you can see here, when it came to the issues of people with working at high risk, you had the Biden administration that originally said everybody should get the booster, the FDA advisory group that said, yep, doctors should get it. The FDA said, yeah, we agree. But then the CDC advisory group said no to people working in high risk groups. And then the CDC director, Walensky, she ended up saying, no, we need to have healthcare workers involved. And I agree with her. I do believe that we are at high risk. We are constantly in, just like Dr. Angelique had mentioned, that if we know that we're boosted, we know that we've got PPE, we know that we're exposed to those who have COVID, we don't need to worry. We can still continue to do what we need to do until we have symptoms, and then we need to treat. And then if we get positive, we should have access to monoclonal antibodies early in our infection, wherever it's available. We have to take care of ourselves, and we need to have access to monoclonal antibodies, even if we're vaccinated and if we, at the minute we get positive. I have seen my colleagues who've gotten sick post-vaccination, who got monoclonal antibodies, and who told me it was the worst they ever felt, and had they not gotten the infusion, they don't know if they would have made it. So I think that is the way we need to do it, and we need to start with the booster doses.
Thank you, Monica. I agree with you.
So, okay, so we have questions coming up now. Dr. Salma, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. What I wanted to ask the panel was that they have accepted, the UK government, the Sinopharm and the Sinovac vaccine, which are mostly used in Pakistan. But we also use CanSino, that is a single dose vaccine, and they do not accept it. Does anybody know what the reason for this is? Because if our kids have got CanSino and they can't enter UK that way, because I don't want to overdose them. Thank you.
Dr. Monica, actually, I didn't get that answer. Decided because the time is going to be over. I actually I could not understand you that answer. Actually, when I say the WHO actually in influenza cases, the virus, this vaccine gives only just more than 50%, and that is acceptable. And when the other inactivated vaccines are giving 78 to 82% range, and the Pfizer, Moderna, RNA vaccines are giving more than 95%. And you are thinking for a booster when it is coming down to 78%, which is not much lower. Why the US or others, they're thinking that to go for booster? That is not, did you answer? Actually, I couldn't get it.
I agree with you. There is no equity in terms of distribution of type of vaccine, booster recommendations, and even now travel. I don't have an answer for you. All I could do was highlight for you what the news were in terms of how they were addressing it.
Thank you.
Okay, so with this note,
I'd like to, Saurabh, I'd like to just have a plea, actually. Just Dr. Sajjad was taking this motion actually several times. If anybody here actually joining the WMA conference actually, which is going to start from 12th, and probably on 15th, we'll have a general assembly. And in that assembly, we have an agenda. There's an urgent agenda regarding the Dr. Sajjad actually has mentioned. This is very important. And they are in that agenda, and I have seen that they have mentioned actually clearly that those vaccines actually recommended or approved by the WHO, they have not mentioned these lines. I think this is very much pertinent, because we cannot accept this may not be accepted acceptable to other countries which are not accepting this proposal. And now they are not, even the UK also just denying. The Covishield is denied in the UK. Even if it is a biosimilar to AstraZeneca. So this is actually quite a complete disparity actually, what they're showing. So this is actually what I say. I mean, if we agree, we have to raise these questions actually in the WMA General Assembly. If anybody here is joining, thank you.
okay, so Dr. Chong, can we close the session then?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this 79th session. And Monica, for always a brilliant presentation. So thanks to all. And, we look forward to next week's session again. And we've learned always so much from these sessions. And it's been a pleasure, coming to these sessions, although a bit late today. It was swamped with patients. Okay, all the best to everyone, and have a good week and what's left of it ahead, and good week ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. See you next week, same time.